Hi, this is an introduction for Paul Petrie. This is September 8th, our first meeting for the fall in the Upper Valley Woodturners. And this is going to be a knockout, I think. Paul has produced articles for fine woodworking, for the AAW. I mean, it's a long list of credentials. But the thing that I'm impressed with the most is this cliche of finding your own voice always bothers me. I mean, I think that's a dumb cliche. But I talked with Paul about evolving your own style, and I'd like him to say a word or two just about how that happens, because he clearly has evolved a style that is admirable, and it certainly didn't start like that. But in addition to this demonstration, which generously, Paul is going to give us instructions about setting up the jig and how to do it, and has no qualms about producing it for sale, like John Beaver's wind up with that jig that Heath made the day after. I think it was a week after, and that Heath came up. Taught us about. So I think this is going to be really exciting. We figure about 2 hours, two to three, somewhere in there.
Somewhere in there.
And in the comment we were talking about finishing and what have you over there. If you'd make some comments.
Oh
about
yeah,
that.
we're open to everything.
Okay. All right, because I think
any answer I can make up, I'm ready.
Okay. Anyway, without any further ado, then we'll go with Paul.
Just a quick note, if we do some, we're going to have some questions. I'd like to get the questions on the video if we could. So if you have a question, I'm going to hand you the mic, okay?
Yeah, the question part of it is anytime you got something at any given point, just speak up and, because one thing that happens with this, I'll kind of jump around a bit in the beginning. A lot of this that we're going to do here, I have to do a lot of vocalization of it because it's very difficult to actually see. If we're turning, you can watch a tool, you can watch a stance, you can watch all these other things. But with this, it's kind of difficult. But I want to explain to you how I came about this and what I feel that it can do to simple work, utilitarian work, up to whatever you want to make out of it. But I've always been enamored with surface decorations and changes within the surface structure of an object to make it either different or enhance different parts of it. And I can't exactly say where this actually idea came from, but I got fooling around. I've had, a router. We've all got routers. This we're going to see here was the original shot at this whole deal. And I'll explain to you why this system, which I'll bring up next, is, I think, much far superior. And it is just one man's opinion. There's every time I've done this, everybody's come up with different ideas on how it could be changed. A lot of people think of it in the form of production work. I do not do production work, and this is not, it's a manual system. And this, I guess you could call, at one time I called it Neanderthal wood turning, but it's not turning wood, so it's Neanderthal woodworking. All this stuff that you see in front of you came off the floor, except for, well, the router was on the floor too. So it all came from the floor. I think the bit I bought out of a store. But the one thing I wanted to do was to make certain cuts on a object that followed the contour of the object no matter what it is. So really you need some type of pin to ride on the vessel that your bit comes through or next to, or depending on what. So when you do it, it will follow everything you want to do. So number one, you've got to have an ability to hold this object at a certain point. So really, this is just a disc. On the back of this, it's indexed, and I flipped it around because people were getting too confused. This piece is not being indexed by this. The lines are already drawn. All this is doing with a clamp is keeping it from moving. So it could be a square piece of wood, doesn't matter. Because I don't want this to move when I go to work. So therefore, I've got a disc, it's just behind the chuck, it doesn't have to be tight, just enough to hold it. I needed a platform to work off of and a way to hold it, which is just a piece of 1x2 pine that essentially in the end, you clamp and it can't move. Now, for a long time, I said, I'm reaching over, it's, one more step, and I'll put this here. The problem is that you're limited by what you're doing with your chuck. So that was one more limit. I have a set of jaws I didn't use on this that were originally made by Stuart Batty in one of his, I'm going to make $1 million deals, that are they stick out quite a ways, which are nice because it gives me a lot more ability to get in back of a shape. So there's a limit, and you have to think of this when you turn your object. So anyways, this reaching over part is acceptable because I'm not doing, for every minute it's costing me a penny. So I've got an ability to hold this in position. I've got an ability to work on it. Now, the thing that allows me to do also is a real high-tech system of drawing, which is a stick with a stick. But the thing about, I don't know how many people have tried to draw lines on a tool rest. And if you're over a little bit, and as you ride up on the pencil, the line is either going up or down. Well, with this, I can just sit there and then rotate and do anything I want. So it makes a nice little ability to draw. All right. Now, a lot of these pieces over there are based on 3/8 apart lines. Now, when you go to draw a diameter and divide it, you got to multiply it by pi and all that to come up with your diameter, and divide it by, say, 3/8. There's two ways you can do it. One, you predetermine how many 3/8 you can fit in X number of size diameter, and you turn the piece to that diameter. Or you get close to it, check it, and do it. The other one is at some point you cheat just a little bit with each one, because the eye, when it's done in a rhythmic form, not one big jump, doesn't see it. Very few people, I should say. So the other thing is, if you go to put lines on this at 3/8 and you were to use a set of calipers, you have a curve, but you're drawing straight across so it's wrong. So you just take a little piece of something that's flexible, you put your and then you just hold it. So now I'm really following the circumference of this in line with the circumference, and you'll find out in the end you're a lot closer to being right. So essentially at this point, I've taken an area here and I've drawn a bunch of 3/8 lines. And the first two things we're going to do are based on that 3/8. So now I have lines which I drew across, and at the bottom, which you can't see, I figured a starting point, and we'll get to this in a minute, where I could come in to start. So I just took, again, the idea of this, brought my pencil up here. There's my starting line. Nice and round, it's not holding it on the thing, makes it easy. And on a couple of those, if you notice on the bottom, they don't start at the same point, they step. So you can have multiple lines for multiple starting points, just a little bit of variation. Now, all this really is I started out with a base and a tower, then I bandsawed a circumference to allow for this router body to fit tight. Very high-tech band to hold it in place. And I took a dowel, as we see, brought it up to 10 inches in height off of this, or actually it's 9 1/4 because this is 10 without it, for a center point. Drilled a hole, which is really difficult to draw a straight hole through a round object and not have it sideways. Had to put a little bit of support, I found, because they did have flex. And my idea was that this will always index no matter what I'm doing, and my depth will always be the same. Now, one of the problems in depth being always the same, this is 3/8, this is not 3/8, because it's on a taper. So therefore, I'm going to cut more of the unfinished edge here with the same depth as I will here. If that makes sense. Because this is smaller, the lines are tough. I'm leaving a flat spot. The flat spot's getting smaller towards the bottom. So manually, as you go in, you don't go in like this. You go into the side, you're not cutting the thing, and you kind of finesse your way on a curve. I'm cutting, and then as I come up, now I'm going straight. So I've actually changed the depth. This is all manual. And I am sure that an engineer kind of guy would have, you know, outriggers and everything and be able to sit there and just, do this thing. I talked to a couple guys came up to me when I did Totally Turning and had ideas on how to do a manual rotation of the 3/8, with gears and all this. But the problem is, when you're done with it, when you lay this piece out, you will find that they're not all 3/8. At some point, you got to cheat a little. So that manual indexer, crank, or at some point, it's going to screw up. So it's just as easy to have the lines, take a moment, make sure it's on the line, clamp it, and go. So this has a long ways in which it can go depending on what you want to do with it. And in my case, I am very bad at getting something that works and then stopping right there. I don't tweak it. I don't go back because it's doing what I want. I get a feel because with my hands and my ears of doing exactly what I want to do. So that will stop me from changing. And the only reason, just a quick sidelight, I went from this to that because I wanted to do the insides of shallow bowls. And it sucks. It did, but it brought me to a point where I redesigned something that works even better on the outside. So again, it's, and the thing is, when we're all said and done here, one of the things some of the guys have done and some of these demos have done that were interested in trying this was they kind of all got together as a group and built their towers or whatever you want to call them rather than individually. So it's just a router, a way to hold the router steady and straight, a pivot point, no matter how you do it, and a table to work on. So the first one we're going to do, and I haven't done, this happens to be in here, I haven't used this in a long time, but there's a cherry bowl over there with that copper gilded interior. This is the shape that we're going to go for right now. It's just kind of an external beaded shape. And again, this is a 3/8 bit. You can put any size you want. And the one thing that I got, and I'm not sure it's true, but I kind of got into it, is I try to have the hole as close to the true size of the bit. Because at some point, especially when you get down, if you're going all the way around, the last one or two, you haven't got a lot of surface area that's still flat. And if you had a big hole, the chances are you could drop out. So I thought that it's best to keep that as tight as possible, which with this system is very difficult because you got to make a new post every time, and I'll show you on that why that one became easier to work with. So really what we're doing is, and again, you want lighting at least to be able to see your lines. No, I got it. Thank you very much. This is going to be a good experiment. This is a piece of butternut. I apologize on the shape. It falls apart right about here, but I got lazy and said, there it is. I'm running about 1/4 of an inch thick. I'm going in about 1/8 of an inch. So it's leaving me a little bit on the side. I do sand because I have to be repetitive on things. This has been sanded to 400, even though for the most part, if I was to do the whole thing, I'm wiping out all my sanding. But I think if you get into a habit of changing your pattern, say I sanded at 180. Well, inadvertently, somewhere along the line, I'm going to do something else and I'm going to stop at 180. It's going to come to bite me. So I do everything the same. I could talk a lot about sanding because it's the least understood and the most abused tool in your toolbox. What's the last thing outside of a decent finish you see? sanding. How many objects, if you really look at them, are nicely done, a lot of work, the sanding falls down and ruins it. And that's the tool you should, as much as everybody says they hate to sand, when you sand, really look at your work, and you will start to see as the sanding gets closer to 400, the grain comes out better, things look nicer. Well, appreciate that and don't complain about sanding, you know, and have a second beer because it washes all that sanding dust away. But so the idea is, because these objects, every one of these, require a lot of sanding afterwards, because the router does make some burn marks no matter how good you are. Different woods do it different ways. And most of these 3/8 bits are right around 20 bucks, I think, give or take. So to me, at some point, I'll go out and spend the 20 bucks to buy a new one before I'll sit there and attempt to do a lousy sharpening job, even though it's, you know, carbide. So, but that's the thing. So you got to be prepared to sand a bit. But, and later, if you get a chance on that spalted maple piece, one of the things that I like about this system is it makes it, I call it 4-dimensional. Because if you look at that, you've got low spots and high spots. Well, that spalting, wherever you cross it, appears to move because you're seeing it high, you're seeing it, and your eye has got this thing in motion. And I think it really produces a nice look in the way that, and this is a relatively decent piece of spalted, but you know, the way, and with this system, it doesn't matter if you got a hole, you're not going to drop into it. In fact, that burl over here's got a big hole. You know, again, because you're manually working it, you're not putting a lot of pressure on here, it's just a guide. So it allows you to make the cuts you want to make. And you can, you know, at some point you may get ones on the end that are a hair more flatter than others, but you can sand that back and make sure all your points are relatively the same, you know, on all of these. And, you know, that's kind of what I'm after. I'm after a surface decor, a touchy-feely sort of thing, because I know that a lot of things I do in the male or female, that picked them up and stuff, you watch them, they're doing just what I'm doing right now. And that's the hook. Take it home, adopt it. That's my, don't, in case you guys want to come up with a new word out of boredom, you don't sell things, you have them up for adoption. It's a surprising, because and it also helps create a better conversation with people. And that's what you're after if you're trying to sell your work, which is, you know, marketing. We were talking about that last night. You know, marketing is a tough thing. So you really want it, but just have nice little terms that excite people. But like I say, to me, it produces a movement as well as it makes backhandedly a lot more surface area. You know, because if it was totally smooth, it's X number of inches of surface area. If it's fluted, that has exponentially gotten bigger by the ins and outs. So it really starts to change things. All right, so what we will do, again, essentially what we're after on this right now is this kind. In fact, this one stands out fairly good. You can see that there were different start points. And that, to me, adds a little bit of interest as well, even though it's sitting like this. But, you know, people catch them when they start to turn it over, you know, you start to notice a difference to it. And, but this is what we're after on the cuts we're going to make right now, is this type of shape. All right. Now, at this point, we would come in here. I find it interesting. I have a Powermatic lathe. And I believe that this is one of the, in fact, I'm sure it is, one of the Chinese, Japanese, whoever, you know, not the Atlanta Power, which mine was one of the last ones ever made in Atlanta. See that space? That's the difference in how this is made up with the chuck system than mine. Because this normally hits tight. Doesn't mean a thing, I just happen to notice it. Okay. So really what I'm doing is I've got a very small point sticking out here, which is the point of the thing. So I'm going to come in here and find that point on my line. Come over here. Now, one thing you want to do, if you don't care what, if you ever use spring clamps, Always recheck what you just clamped, because when they go together, sometimes they move things. So you want to go back and just make sure that that did not move off your line. And theoretically, if this is drawn, that line should go all the way down to here. So what we're going to do, again, we're going to go at this at an angle where right now I'm not cutting at all. It's going to be tough to see this, I think. And then as I come along, you know, it's going to, yeah, that one right there should show. See, it's going to, I'm going to rotate into the cut and then come along. So I'm really starting in an area here where I'm getting no cut whatsoever. And you want to move fairly slow because theoretically, you'll get less burn if you move a router relatively slow. So, and actually in this case, the rotation of this is this way. And I'm cutting that way so it wants to grab and run. I don't particularly like to go this way because I like the bottom because that's where I want to finesse the cut in and out. Well, essentially rotation is this way. And I'm going that way so that it wants to grab and run with the router. Yep. And, well, with this, you got two hands, so you take your time. Yeah, well, this one here, this particular cut is a little bit more difficult than the cove because the cove's more inward and doesn't go as much. Oh, the other, well, any of these, when you go to do them, try to find a way to rotate a couple times by hand to make sure you're not whacking against something. Because when you turn it on, it's going to go, and it can. On the other one, a couple of times I shattered the hole because I didn't put it in right. So it's just, again, you know, like anything, you want to make sure you're safe, you're ready to go. Everything is free and ready to move. So hopefully the depth is right. No, in fact, this is a very old 40 cable. This is a full size, you know, half horse, whatever the heck it is. The depth on that could be a hair deeper. So we'll go with it. How about this one here? Okay. All right. Now the thing is, the roll, because basically it's a, you know, curve to a point. Again, like I say, it could be a hair deeper so that I got just a little bit more roll over the top. But I can change that with some paper. And again, I got my start point at this point almost looks like a very thin line. It hasn't done anything except have the little tip. So the next thing then is we look for number 2. And again, with good lighting, it makes it very easy to see, but we're okay. Make sure it's there. Usually what I do is I push on this side so the thing doesn't move on me. Yep. So at this point, we're going to try to go to the next line up. All right, now I'm barely touching. As long as you're held tight, you're able to make that first pass and then come back again to kind of clean some things up a bit because it's not going to move on you. That's why you really want to have this so that it stays there. It allows you to finesse your cut a little bit more with that router, so it looks a little nicer. No, it's starts at a point. It's got a curve, so it's like two wings, two cups coming away. So the idea is that on the edges there, it's kind of giving a little round over. A V groove is, you know, just 245s or 60s, whatever you particularly get, which we'll use on that one because there's another thing we can do with that. Yeah, this thing is not. All right, then we go back down to the first line again. Now we're touching. That first one was off for some reason. I'm not sure what. These are moving around a little bit. All right, we'll do one more.
Hey, Paul, I have a question for you.
Yep.
So if you're doing long, short,
Okay.
short, do you pre-think, or, thanks. Do you pre-think how you're going to end up? Do you pre-think how you're going to end up so that it's long, short,
All
all
right.
the way around? But
You have to
you
be
have to pre-think that it's
right.
not
You
gonna
have
end
to
up
count
long,
your
long.
numbers.
Yeah.
Because it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, back to 1. So it's only divided by 4, not 5. Yeah, there's a little math to figuring out how many of the steps by the numbers that you have. Because once in a while, even a 1, 2 doesn't work. So you got to start out all even. So you know, if you want to, you got to go through the whole thing. And then what I always do is I just sit there and I put numbers on them. Because I can figure this thing out, and then all of a sudden, wait a minute. So you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, then it's 1. So it's actually only divided by 4. We think it's going to be divided by 5 because it's 5 steps, but it isn't. You're always going back to 1. So you got to sit there and figure out a little bit ahead of time, you know, where you're going with it.
How do you figure out 1, 2, 3, 4? How do you figure out right now? What the 1, 2, 3, 4, and how do you figure out the pattern you're going to use, and what's your numbering system?
Well, again, here we start out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, back to 1. So the number I had was divided by 5. If it doesn't come out an even 10 5s, then it doesn't work. Even though you know, because the last step is not the beginning. The beginning is always 1. So, you know, you've got X number of 1s, so you try to figure out, well, I'd like to make a pattern, so how can I divide that up? So you just think of stepping. Always knowing that the last number essentially stops you the step before the because beginning is number 1. So in this case, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I basically divided these, and we'll say there's 30 of them there. By 5, I get 6. I can do it, and it works. Because sometimes it just doesn't, the numbers, there's a little math to it, rather than just starting the same every time. You know, that just gives you a different bottom. And the thing about it is, in most cases, you almost don't notice it until you really look. Because in this case, it blends right out. But until you really look at it, do you notice that there's a difference? On different woods, walnut and stuff, it stands out a lot if you make steps. So there is some math involved that can be, you know, a little frustrating at points. All right, we'll do one more of these, and hopefully I'll do a better job of lining it up.
So what happened on this?
I missed one of the lines by a little bit, and it made the top one thin. And I think the bottom one got a little thick, so. There, that should be it. So we're back to second one up. The walnut's a little stringy. Yeah. Which is not surprising. Yeah, well, it's just stringy. It moves a little. So anyways, at that point, you would complete, all the numbers you want to go through. Now, from there becomes sanding time.
I don't know if anybody else is numerically impaired, but I am. I don't know if anybody else is numerically impaired, but could you back up and explain how you got to 5 in this example?
Well, in the one that I had there, I've got my start point. I went one ring, one step.
Yep.
That's 2. Then at 3 and 4, they were the same. 5 is bringing me back down, and now I'm down to the beginning again. So I'm making steps in any way I want to make them, because I put this one just has 2.
2 what?
2 starting points. One low, one a little bit higher.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see.
Yeah, I see. Oh, okay. That's for the stagger.
There's
grooves.
one.
I see.
There's 2. There's 1. There's 2. And this would have been back down, so forth, so on. So I can change, like in one case, I could be up here. There's 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's telling me that how many of these I have, how much room I have to divide by 4. If it comes out even, I can do those number of steps.
Okay, now I understand.
Because there's always a 1.
Okay, that's an answer to a question I didn't know I had. And that's important.
But
how did you get to the number of lines?
The biggest problem that happens in a lot of things I always find is you can explain till you're blue in the face till somebody actually touches it and goes, oh, because it's hard sometimes to make this imaginary picture and explain to people what that imaginary picture is about. And then if they get a little bit of hands-on to it, they start to understand the principles, then it becomes clear. It's kind of like you learn something and didn't realize it until you tried to do it. So that's the big part of that. Now at this point,
show this one.
Yeah, okay.
Really stands out.
Where are we at? Which one do we want to go with?
Yeah.
All right.
Where do you get that first?
Can you see the steps in that? So you got 1, 2, 3, 4 actual steps, because then you're back to 1. So this thing would have been divided by 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
So there's only 4 movements because you're always back to 1.
I understand that part. Could you turn it over and go to the lip of the bowl, please? The rim, okay? Now, every groove, how did you determine the number of cuts you were going to make in total before you started dividing them?
Diameter
Right.
times 3.1416, which is pi, gives you circumference.
Right.
Then you divide it by 3/8.
Thank you.
Now,
That's the piece I missed.
The magic of 3/8?
is the size that I'm working with. The bit. If it was smaller and it was 1/4, I have to divide it by 1/4. It's the size of the cut I'm going to make. or represent is 3/8. And this, and on this bit, and the next one we're going to use.
What's the largest bit that you would use?
3/8.
3/8.
I'd be well, because they're bit, they make a 1/2 inch. I think they make a 1/2 inch cove. So you maybe, but then you're getting pretty large in what you want to do. You know, to do a really wide expand. And keep in mind, as it gets wider, it also gets deeper to get the full cove. So at 1/8, 3/8 bit works really good. If you went to 1/2 inch, you may have to go to 3/16 deep, which you then have to interpret in the thickness of your vessel. So each one has more than one measurement.
Where do you get the bits?
Any Home Depot, catalog, you know, they're not anything special. They're just 1/4 inch shanked bits. Yeah. And I think, like I say, they're $20, give or take, for the small one. I have, in the box, I have a 1/16 of an inch cove, and I have a 1/16 inch straight bit. So you can go that small, you know, which are easily found generic. And there are companies out there that, for the right amount of money, will make any bit you could think of, which are really nice because I've used a couple.
Why not 1/2 inch shank?
Well, again, that's the trim router will not take a 1/2 inch shank bit. So therefore, that's why, you know, and actually there are a number, I don't know if, I haven't, I'm trying to remember if I've seen a 3/8 cove bit that was a 1/2 inch shank. I don't think so. Maybe wrong. You know, straight bits, you can get 1/2 inch shanks with small straight bits. And then there are some bits, they just don't make the bigger shank, the bigger shaft on the smaller bits. So that's really the only reason. And I think what had happened when I first started to do this, that was probably laying on the shop floor, was a 1/4 inch shank. I mean, let's be honest, you know? So that's why that went in there. Because this was the first try that I made, was, you know, using this effect like on that cherry bowl. Now, the next thing comes to what you got to do to sand. The only infomercial I ever give at any demonstration is about sandpaper. This is carborundum sandpaper. Sticky back sandpaper. They make Sheikah, they're out of Canada. Most of their sandpaper is made for the automotive industry. It's easy to get. It's by far, at least in my experience, I've got, I should have brought them with it and given them all to you. I've got stacked reams of sandpaper sheets that when I got this, that's where they stopped. I never used them again. I don't care who the manufacturer was. Norton, 3M, doesn't matter who. The carborundum paper is probably one of the best papers I've ever seen. You can take this, and I won't do it here because it's a sticky back. But you know, if you take a piece of sandpaper and you fold it in half and you crease it and you open it, you see a line. This you do not. The granulars don't break apart. It is absolutely phenomenal stuff. And the sticky back allows you to put it on different types of material that you want. This is a Venetian blind, which anybody that does woodworking should always have. And anytime you go to a junk shop and you get metal Venetian blinds, buy it. Because first of all, you could cut this to match this kind of idea of a shape and have a little thin line. If you bend it, it's a fine line scraper on a table, on a beaded edge. Or it's a really great piece that you can put for the sticky back sandpaper to get in. This is 120. So you got a line in there that got cut. But it gives you something to support your hand And you can also roll it a little bit and start to roll the edges over. I got a hell of a line in there. But anyway, so what you've got to do is you've got to, when you're done, get all your marks, you know, sand it out, starting at 120, and work your way down. And as you get to the end, in this case, I've got just a line, a straight line, and I'm able to stay right in that straight line and accentuate it. And then as you move along, these are, I don't know if anybody ever uses the 3M makes them, so does Carver on them. The pad sanders, they're a little 3x3. Well, when you wear them out, they become the backer for your sticky back, so they never wear out. And you can put anything you want in there. So basically at this point, but it allows you to get the curves and stuff you want. And you just keep going down to your 400 and you got to sand it out. But the, you know, this paper in the back, and you know, when you're done, you basically just peel it off, throw it away, or, you know, whatever you want. But so your backer is still good. And you can, and this other one, I'll show you now, because the other one's a cove. Steel rod, 3/8 dowel, sticky back sandpaper. So you can make contours for anything you want to make. And all you do with the sandpaper, is it still there? No. Oh, no, that's right, it's wrong side. Put it on the rod, roll it. I roll it by itself. When I roll it back, you'll see a thin white line. Now when I roll it together, there's no bump. It's perfectly there. And it'll stay there for as long as I want it to. I'll give you an example on that piece with the mother of pearl and the abalone in it. All those curves had to be heavily sanded, and I used the very small needle files, but I put sticky back sandpaper wrapped around the needle file to be able to get into all the spaces. And it stays, you know, until it's no good, and then you just toss it. And they make it for any, I don't know, the grits go way up, but the idea is everything in there had to be sanded after it was cut. So with it wrapped around the needle file, I mean, and I used a popsicle stick, which are the greatest things in the world, by the way. Flat ways to do the curve this way and the curve that way, just with a little sticky back sandpaper wrapped around it.
They started out straight.
No, these were cut curves. That part stayed the same. Cut it with my piercing tool. I have you know what a gourd cutter is? Has anybody seen it? And one of those. I was going to do it with my gourd cutter, but because of the high spots, I was worried about it dropping in. So I went back to the piercing tool, which 7.5 hours in this, not including the layout. It was almost 15 minutes per cut to finish. An SK, regular period, you know, air driven demo. But the reason I brought this, we'll get to this, because this is also a system used off of this that did all the cutting in here, and I'll explain why. Which could have been done with a parting tool somewhat. All right, so the idea once again is we would sit there and we'd sand away, get this all done. And one of the things to do, anytime you sand anything repetitively, is always give yourself a little X with a pencil to tell you where you started. So you don't go, where the hell did I start? Where? And you know what happens? You always finish one short. And you put the finish on and you go, I was one short. So I'm not smart enough. Because on the end, my last 400 gets rid of that little pencil mark, you know. Except be careful in stuff like ash and stuff, because the porous part of the pencil will go in there. And whatever you do, don't use an eraser to take it off. Use sandpaper, because the eraser will just impregnate right into the grain. All right, so essentially that's where this one came from and what it did. Now, what evolved from that, like I say, originally I wanted to go inside of shallow bowls, and obviously the rod won't let me in. So I decided to make something that would allow me to an inside, which, as I say, turned out to be a really bad idea. It didn't look right. You know, with all these coves coming out of the interior of a piece, it was too bad, but it just did not look right. And what I'll do, as we're working with this, here, pass this around. This is what one of these looked like. Again, it's a trim router, a lot easier to hold. I feel it runs better. There's a lot of things about it that are nice. So again, what I had to do was to get an ability to have a surface to be able to follow. And again, maple, all stuff off the shop. I epoxied studs so I could clamp things. Same out here. And in this case, I just brought two wings out with a little slot in them, which we'll see in a minute when we take this off after. And I'm running about 3/8 of an inch for this cove bit. So I made myself a little teeny gauge, which was a 3/8 hole cut in half, so that I can go, yep, that's just about 3/8, you know, off the edge. Because again, I feel I'm hitting here and the bit is hanging out. So that was just a little thing of that nature. Now, again, the harder part with this particular system is when I got the face mounted, I still have to turn that bit to make sure it's not hitting. So, you know, it's a little tougher where the other one, you know, I had a lot more space of the bit I could grab. But you still want to make sure it turns and doesn't hit anything. Piece of forceps. I've had different ideas about shallowing this up a little bit so I could touch that nut, you know, just as the idea of being able to rotate it. And again, with this, when I get ready to use it, I want that bit to be flat so that when I know where the line is. If it's this way right now, if it's this way, I can't see that little point to be able to make sure I'm on the line because it's a rounded point. So laying flat ways, I can put it here, and if I want to, I can actually take it and do it a couple of times by hand, and you'll see a little line drawn, you know, a little indicator mark where it's ripping it a little, tells me I'm on the line. Same idea, same ability when I go in is to stay off on an angle because I'm not touching yet and finesse my way into the cut. But I think, you know, and it allows me to, I believe, to see things a lot better. Originally, I'll tell you a good story, which maybe somebody here can tell me why. I used to do a lot of hand cut spirals. Stuart Mortimer is a hero of mine. And I said, well, geez, maybe I can do spirals with this system just by manually turning whatever. So what I did is I found dead center and I put a very small steel pin as close as I could to the edge of the hole, thinking that if I made a spiral, I take my fret saw, cut the spiral so I got a line. Now, if I get the pin in the line and I slowly rotate it, it'll follow that spiral. Through the spiral, because the spiral was tighter and then wider, it lifts the router off the table. So the angle of curve and the angle of cut are not consistently the same. It's almost like that pin should have been able to climb higher to follow, but then it wouldn't be. And so I've never figured out, because I'm not an engineer, why the hell that happens. But it would, you know, because I took the easiest thing to do is take your belt off your machine. So now you got really a freewheeling thing. So you can just sit there and I got about part way, it came out and then it was going to be steeper. As soon as I got the steeper part of the curve, I could never reach the line and the cut at exactly the same plane. So it actually made the router want to go up. And I don't know why. So that idea was gone. But the thing is, mathematically, somewhere in there, that center point changes because of the climb. And I don't know. I didn't think of that idea even of trying to keep this down tighter so that it forced it into there. But I was only maybe, I don't think I was much more than 4 millimeters difference from the cutter to the point. You know, it was as close as I could be without falling in the hole. And yet it's still, at some point, the axis changes. And because you know, if you do them by hand, you don't really notice that, you know, because they take Sureform files and cut them and then, you know, sand them out and get whatever kind of spiral, barley spiral or whatever I want. But anyways, that was an idea. One of the few things I actually said, well, I'll try it, and ended up being a mess. All right, so right now we're online. We're looking at the same thing. And again, we start out right now with 2 different steps. These will show up a lot more than the lines. And again, we're going to look at where we're at, make sure we're clear. See, with this one, I could have gotten a little deeper if I wanted to, but we're going to use the same. So again, everything is clear. Stand back. Yep. Always remember to wait till it stops before you go to grab the bit. Not that I've ever done that before. I don't think there's much that I haven't almost done. That thing rode up a little in the beginning. Second. When you get, as you come up on the end, kind of slow down a bunch. So you don't get anything where, you know, if you're moving along too quick and drop your way by, you want to kind of finesse off the end too. Which you know, all these things, if anybody's ever used a router, you're doing exactly the same thing. The only difference is you're holding a platform versus the 2 arms or whatever you're using on a router. It's just habit that I like it flat. Big thing is that you come up on the line. Got a little shadow here. Back to number 1. All right, now what I want to do is I want to set this up for something else. I will let that go. Let's say we come over here. I'll make a couple more passes with this, and then we'll, I'm going to set up a straight bit So we'll send this around. Now, I just jumped a section. Once I get to about here. Nope, you can't. Well, you could. You could set this at one shallow depth, do the whole thing, and come back and start again and redo every one of them. But in this case, you're just finessing your way at the beginning. Instead of going at it this way, you start here. You're not cutting. You're hitting out here. And you slowly turn it in till you start to cut. Now, if I keep that angle a little bit, then I can go do this. So this area here was shallow because it's not full depth. So I'm kind of doing it by eye to give my depth being less at the beginning than at the end. And then when you start to sand it out, that was good, fill it with sandpaper. As I'm going like this, if there's any kind of hump where I went from shallower to deep, by the time I sand it, it sands that out, but it's very slight. So it's all done by feel rather than anything else. Okay, supposedly we're there. Okay. Stepping one more step. One more, and then we'll be setting up. Now, the one thing that does happen is since you are starting out, this is another little, with a rounded edge down here. As you sand out, you go from a rounded beginning to a taper, and you do that with sanding. All right, one more of these. All right, now at this point, you would have completed what you wanted to do. Get this out of the way for a minute. We'll sand this a little, and then, like I say, I want to change bits here, and we'll, all right, first one's just terrible. Okay.
Got a question.
Yeah, I'm
On
listening.
the router bit, how do you know when you're going to replace it? Is it starting to burn?
Yeah, when you're cut. It's no different than if you're turning and you start to feel you go back to the grinder. It's the same idea when you start to use it and you notice that it seems like you got to put a little bit more effort to get it cut. Maybe there's a little more burn, there's a little chatter. That's pretty much telling you, I think, that your bit's time to change. Or you can go to a diamond hone and see if you can just run it a few times. The other thing that happens with any cutting tool is periodically you should get all that resin that's built up on from when you're cutting off. Now, whether you soak it in something, lacquer thinners, or depending on how your feelings are about chemicals, there are sap degreasers that you can buy through woodworking stores. Quite often you can just get in there with a little piece of sandpaper, sand some of that stuff off, and then take a diamond hone and clean it up so you're not using any solvent at all. Yeah, okay. Windex does a lot of stuff too that you don't understand, that I find. But, so quite often it could be no more than buildup. Drill bits, piercing bits go through that all the time. You're always rubbing them out. At least I use a card file or a brass brush because the little flutes in there build up with resin. They don't cut as well. So you just, but all that stuff, a lot of cases, is resin. Where are we at? Oh yeah. So basically, you just start to run out what you want, and as you come to the end, and I'll leave some on and some off. You really sand through, and that starts to develop because you've got to come out to nowhere. Anytime you put a router bit in something, there's a point in which the router bit is here and the surface you went into is here. So unless you want to find a way to sand that in, you want that curve to break free into the air. So when you do it with the sanding, you start to get a point where this breaks through into the air. And quite often, depending on where they're at, I use the fact that this is when I hit this, that way I keep a consistent point. And depending on what you want to do, I should put something on this. You can run different size dowels, different whatever you want. You could take any of these ideas, and if you skip wider spaces between and leave your really flat surfaces, you could sit there with a wood burning thing and do some nice little lines. You could paint that, you could gild it, to leave a different effect in between what you're doing. So they don't always have to, sky's the limit on that. And with a little bit of care, butternut will work. Oh, that one's terrible.
What are the qualities of butternut?
Stringy. Tears easy. Great wood. I mean, it's really nice. You oil it before you finish it. Great color. And butternut by me is somewhat disappearing because of the fact that it used to be a wood that was always around farmsteads because the farmers always had butternut, walnut, edible. And as these farmsteads have become mass developments or whatever, the trees have been whacked out and ended up in firewood piles. All right, essentially, what you're doing is you can, if you wanted to, you could do a real small one like that on the end to give yourself more of a point. So you're using the sanding as a sculptural device. And, you start out with the 120 takes the longest because you're trying to get rid of all the imperfections that you find, like little burn marks. And then after you get by that and move to 180 and so forth on the way down, it starts to go faster. But you got to want to, because that's the whole deal with this, is they're really meant to be clean and well done. So what we'll do here, once I find my gizmo, hey Mo.
Fall on that one unusual one. Can you save that?
No,
Want to repeat the question?
no. That right there, you mean?
Yeah, on that one screw up.
No.
Is there any way to save that? Or?
Okay. Since this is still in the ability to be in a chuck, you could come in, make sure that everything is running correctly. And you could change if the shape, or do something there that might be an accent or something that way. But I learned a long time ago, you have to learn graciously how to accept disaster. And hope your dog isn't nearby because you want to kick him. It's his fault.
How about just using your router and making a
Well, you
highlight?
could do, and we're going to do some of those, and we'll try it there and see what happens. We do a rotation the opposite way, But normally that happened truthfully because I wasn't paying attention in the beginning. I went at it a little bit too quick. But if you really take your time, and I think in the last 10 or 15 pieces that I've done this sort of thing, and maybe even more, I think I had one that barely moved, but I was ready. As soon as I felt something different, I stopped. Now, see, in my case, and it's just me, you can't work in my shop with any kind of radio, somebody yelling at you, phones, nothing. You got to listen to this. And when you listen to the wood, it will tell you a great number of things before the problem occurs. And if you do any natural edge work, it'll tell you when the bark or something's getting, you're going to be in trouble. But these guys, and again, I understand why people do it. They have radios going and all this distraction. I have no clue how the hell they do anything, because I can hear this. And that's me. You know, that's the way I got into woodworking, was in a strictly quiet atmosphere. And so therefore, that's the way I've done this. So, but going along, if I'll feel a movement in that thing that feels like it wants to rise or something. I was moving too fast usually. So you just take your time. All right, what we'll do is I'm changing this thing. We'll send this around. And these three here are the ones that came right off of what we just did. The first two here were sanded enough to show you what the bottoms start to be. Oops, somebody want to grab that and we'll change. Because what I want to do here next is, now, what happened to that piece of this that went, oh, there it is. That's the one I need. Let me grab this. I'll show you what. Well, do this. Doesn't matter. That big maple bowl over there has an insert in the front. That's this piece of sapelli veneer. And that's what we're going to do next, is what I call creating windows like that. Now, when I did this, it was a piece of, it was green, just about, not ringing wet green, but awful close to a piece of cherry. And when I turned it, and it was all done, it's, again, about 1/4 of an inch. You know, it was slightly out of round. Not bad, I was really surprised. But now, I could have easily, while I was mounted, taken a parting tool, got a mark on it for depth, 1/8 of an inch, and cut these, knowing at one point it's going to be cut deeper than another, because as the rotation comes. Now, by doing it with a router, as the rotation came around, the router is going to follow it out and in, and so my depth would always be the same. So it allowed me to remove this, all of this, and put a starting 2 cut here for depth. So then I could turn it around. So that's why I brought this, was the fact that, you know, there's a lot of things you can do. And with this, you know, again, that veneer was put into there by creating that recess. You know, I call them windows. But there's a lot of things you can do with a straight bit. I mean, you can make a line, you can do the same, you can do all kinds of stuff, but again, you can move to a straight bit and be able to do different things. Yes, 1/4 inch bit. Yep. Yep. Everything here has been done with the 1/4 inch bit. Yep.
Do you do like an upcut?
Now well, actually, I'll show you here in a minute. Let me get the, let's hope we were smart enough. Yeah. Just basically a Irwin 1/4 inch shank router bit. So again, with this, I'm able to remove the face. There's a button, there it is. The biggest one of the other problems that you have with this kind of system is setting your bit at a depth in here that allows you to get your depth out here. In other words, some bits, this is only a straight bit, but it's only got a 5/8 inch long shank. The other ones normally have a 1-inch shank. And the problem was, if I use that in here, it sticks out too far here. So I wasn't able to adjust my depth because I've only got so much with this system to go in and out. So I had to remember on the, you know, the brand new one I bought that I can't use, I went, ah, damn, it's 5/8. So that allows me to get what I want out of this. Yep. Yep. Well, you know, once again, like I say, there's a bunch of little tweaky things. Come on. That I could do if I really sat down and had the time or took the time to be able to create some of the problems that I have. We'll say.
You turned that, right? That piece that you're holding.
Yep. Yeah, I actually made a. That's a little deep. Yeah, basically it was a square, you know, square board. Did that on a drill press. Made a on my chuck. I just turned a waste piece that allowed me to put a screw in my square board here and here, so it's mounted like that. And then I turned it and then drilled the hole using that as center. You know, which allowed me to do that. And I think that the idea of this functions well because I don't need this depth anymore. I needed it when I was trying to do the interiors because I had to get into an interior. So reality, this projection here could be a lot less, which would bring, this started out as a piece of 5/4. If I use 3/4, this would be shallower, which would be fine. It would also bring me away from the router a little bit further. And then I could, you know, rather than grabbing the bit, I could probably touch the nut. But since I made, you know, since I did it and it worked, I made 5 or 6 new ones. And I made them all the same way I made the first one. Rather than, okay, we'll change it now because I know that worked. And then I just, you know, epoxied studs in. And that was it. And, you know, it's just done with a fret saw. But where is it? You know, that one's set up for an 1/8 of an inch bit. Again, you know, just a little small hole. Again, I want to keep as tight as possible. Now we got to heat up the glue gun. Okay. One of the things you can do, if you choose, is you can put stops to allow you to not go that way or that way. You know, on these things, and you just use hot glue and just stick them on there and then pop them on. So does anybody want to see this bit, or does everybody understand a little cold bit? All right. Okay. Again, make sure everything rotates. Okay. Get rid of this. All right, if I can have that piece back again for a minute. All right. Four. 1, 2, 3. There it is. Okay. So what we're going to do here with the straight bit is we're going to create a window or whatever you want to call it. So again, we want some line. I'm going to make it in between these two areas here. So we'll call it one here. And let's do a one. Okay. I'm going to give the hot glue a minute. So at this point, you just have your bit where you can see the wings of it, and you would set it right on the line that you want to work on. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hot glue this at that angle right there. And that allows me, I don't know if you can see it, I've got two lines that go this way. So I'm going to go in between these, leaving no farther down than this line. And then, so I'm going to create a little window in here. So all I'm doing is I'm just holding that bit so that it fits flat on, ooh, what the hell? I just see something. Ah, glad I did that. Yes, I did. Well. Okay, there. Again, if the bit fits flat, both wings touching the wood, that's the angle at which that's at. Come on, sweetie. Well, worst part of it always seems to be when you're ready to use it, and then all of a sudden all it does is just go forever. There we go. That's enough. All right, so that gives me a stop for that end of the world. That thing isn't grabbing. And we would come back up and do the same thing at this end. Jeez, we're having fun here. Okay. Yeah, I know it. Okay. We need that right now. No. All right. I would probably guess they make these things with an on-off switch on it. Have we ever seen one? Oh, there we go. All right. Now, essentially, I've got my starting and finishing points in there. Now, what I've got to do is I got to rotate this around and get myself lined up on the top line, which will be right there. So now I've got a fixed point this way and a fixed point this way. Okay, so I want to go down here more. Okay. Now with this, you're actually going, in this case, straight in. So you just go in slowly so you don't burn your way through a hole. You can actually go in and move a little to get down to the bottom. Thing just moved. Huh. Well, there's something that's never happened before. Of course. Huh. All right. Well, we'll go back. Ah. There it goes again. Usually that. No, it's. Oh, yeah. Well, see? All right. Well, the best thing about this is you see all the things that you got to watch out for. How's that? All right. What we'll do is we'll move this in a different position. I got to say, I've never had that happen before. Okay. All I'm basically doing is going in and moving it by hand. I want to just take up some of the excess. Just removing some of the, because we've still got to get down to where the bottom is. Should be right there. At this point, you're just going to get the full rotation out of the end. Yeah, I moved it twice and we got an overcut. But essentially, what you're trying to do is you're trying to just create a recess within that area. And if you do it right and you don't let it go and pay attention, I drop down over the edge on both of those. But the top part is essentially what we're looking at doing. So you're able to come right across. And Again, with sandpaper, you can round that edge all the way around. If you take your time, you don't create a rough edge like I have there. But essentially what you wanted to do is you wanted to leave the ability to come from a cove to a rounded edge into a recess. And that's actually probably a couple millimeters too deep in reality. Anyway, I noticed that that's part of it. And what we'll do, let me do this. Let me take a second. That's the only good part about this. We can change our depth. Let me do this. All right, hang on. Yeah, that's a little better. That's the idea. That's a little better. Again, you know, you got to pay attention to what you're doing. But then at that point, you know, you can just come in and sand out. And if you're going to overlay something, you can just take it down to like 180 and get it nice and smooth and put an insert in. If you wanted to, you could have some fun and cut window frames, cut out the squares. That way you look through the bowl through like a window and this sort of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff just with a straight bit that you could do and create a different look and an ability to do something different in there. You could take color epoxy and create some type of swirly illusion up to the surface, you know, and this sort of stuff. But that, you know, again, that's just one more thing. And that's like I say with that mother of pearl deal there, because of the eccentric part of it, I was able to get this thing with two of these together so it didn't move, and just basically then shift this one over a little bit more. And again, I was doing that freehand, which is not the way you should do it. You should lock these things. But then I could go around a bit and make the slots I needed to get all the material out. And then while it's still, then I could sand it, you know, with it on the lathe, spin it. And it gave me a nice concentric flat areas that I wanted to deal with. Now, the one other thing we'll do here is we'll flip this one more time. Oop. If I have it, which I hope I do. There it is. This is a V-shaped bit, just straight V. Let's see where we got to end up. Again, I was just checking to see where the depth had to be. This is something you could even do on the rim of a utilitarian bowl, or and all we're going to do is make a couple horizontal cuts and then some vertical cuts. This reminded me of I used to see some old Roman vessels where they just, you know, in the clay, they just would scribe a line around, scribe a line, and then just put horizontal. So you had little squares. Does anybody remember, what was his name? Steve Skinner did a piece that was in AAW, and if I believe there were squares that had little ants in them. But the idea was, to me, that what he did, and I'm not sure how Steve did it, but if you made all these horizontal lines and then made 90-degree lines too, you end up with all these sloped little rectangles or squares, and in between, I think they were ants that he did wood burn. But anyway, you could do little designs in all the little squares. And if you had just a regular generic rim bowl and you put a line, say like 3 lines, and then just went in between, you get a nice little grippy thing that looks like it took a huge amount of time to do. And it really, once you got set up, it doesn't take any time at all. All right, presumably this is ready to go. And let's find the line here. What we'll do, we'll leave these hot blue things. In fact, I'll leave that one. I'll plug that back in. All right, all we're going to do, and again, I'll leave these right on here. So this one, we're going right in. Let's see. Let's give ourselves about that much room. Okay, let's see. We did that. At this point, I don't have any lines, so it's just taking an idea on how far apart I want to make these. Let's do one more. Okay, well, guesswork. In that case, since the radio wasn't on, I could hear when the sound changed. It told me I was now in empty space, so I wasn't able to. I didn't have to cross over. So that's the kind of effect you can get with that, where if you, and again, that could have been all. You know, again, with a little bit of care and proper time, you won't overcut. You know, it's not that it's any excuse I shouldn't be doing that, but.
Have you ever experimented with using the indexing in your lathe for stocks
My,
or rotary cutters?
this is the only index. I don't have an indexing on my lathe. I got that old Powermatic. It hasn't even got a stop, so when I take the chuck off, I got to hold this, believe it or not. This was added afterwards. The hole's there. I think they were going to do it, but they never did. So that's when I actually, with this thing flipped over, the other side of this, I got a piece of paper on it now, but has 365-degree marks all the way around the whole thing. So I had to use this. And I had a similar thing to this, but it's got a pin in it. And that had all holes in it, the other one. So I just pushed the pin, so I had to make my own. Which, you know, I wouldn't have to freehand as much if I had a better deal here, and I wouldn't overcut things. But again, you know, if you had this, you could do some kind of design in here. You could leave it. You could paint different colors to give a spiral design as it went around. So, you know, you're just creating surfaces that you accentuate to do something with. And, you know, no different than, again, if you had taken this and went the whole way, you get a different look on this end. You'd have V's here instead of U's or beads. But I think, you know, the thing that I find with this is once you got this, whatever you did it, built, the things that you can do not only are a lot, but you may do some things you hadn't thought of because you've already got it. You know, you go over to the floor or wherever you have it and you can pick it up and go, geez, you know, maybe I'll do this. Or if I got, again, I always think of regular utilitarian bowls. One of the problems that wood turning to me faces for utilitarian work is you can go to Walmart and come out of China or Pakistan or somewhere, not that there's anything wrong with those, but it's been dropped off in a container and run across the country through to outlets as well as crafts fairs. And they are nice shaped bowls. Now, if you come up with a little rim, people will now look at that differently than telling you, oh, you want $150? So I can get that at Walmart for $25. Well, wait a minute, I've never seen that. Now it's $175. You know, but you're still only paying the minimum wage to do the thing anyway. Let's face it. But the idea is that it's just a little personal touch that takes it out of the barrel or the container that it came in. You know, what you were talking about pens, you know, the guys that are doing snake skins and corn cobs and God, I can't think of all the stuff I've seen. Make them just a little unique from the ones that are coming out of, you know, some pen company. And people look at them and it tells them that they are personal without you having to say it. They know it didn't come out. Plus the fact it's more fun to see what you can come up with next. You know, coffee grounds, you know, an epoxy. You know, I mean, I think that pen-wise, it seems like, I don't know, stones off the road, they seem to come up with a really neat look. You know, the stuff, I never appreciated a lot from pen turners because it was just turning a cylinder. Nothing against that. But then I started to see these guys that are putting all these, you know, the snakeskin ones I've seen are amazing. And all this other stuff in there, and they're really going a whole different way. And it's kind of like, geez, I want one of those, you know. And I'm the one that wants the free pen I can find from some store. But I find myself looking at that, going, wow, that's really neat. So when I put it in my hand, I got something that's really neat, not this. When we left Totally Turning, I'll say this on the air. Totally Turning was at the Hilton in Saratoga. Now, every demonstration room you went into, there was little pads of paper and pens. By the end of the Totally Turning, it was at least 150 pens less. But I still wanted, if I saw one, a pen that I could have that was neat. So the idea is, again, that just a little bit of zip of some kind makes a big difference. I was just down to Ithaca, and a really neat guy is a bolt turner down there. And there's really nice co-ops that they sell through down there that he does real well. But he started adding a little, he makes probably 10-inch salad bowls, really nice ones. And he just started to do a little bit of different decoration around the rim. And whenever he'd go down to see what was going on, the ones that were missing were those, not the generic ones, of his own work. So he was finding that just a little something to put a little personal touch to it added enough that if you had two things side by side, this one was always gone. And if you looked at the two, the only thing different was a little bit around the rim. So that's where, you know, again, something like this can produce a neat effect fairly quickly and nice and consistent, whether the thing is warped or whatever it is, or, you know, no matter how you do it. That I find that when I have it, that's why when I did that, was setting up to do that mother of pearl, I didn't even think twice about the fact that how am I going to get this, my parting tool, to give me a nice depth and scrim. It was just, okay, here it is. Just grab it, and it was done. So, any questions? Anything?
Could you talk about your finishes?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yep. Because I can't think of much, you know. Well, anyways, the finishes that I predominantly use are Sherman-Williams acrylic lacquer. Quite often, there's a oil finish. It's called Bush, B-U-S-H. It's made in Amsterdam, New York. Well, no, it's made by Mohawk Finish in Texas, but the designer and the guy that set it up is a gentleman by the name of Bill Bush in Amsterdam, New York. Yeah. I think, I'm not sure, but I think you can save a buck. But Bill also, he will sell what he calls a turner's kit, which gives you a smaller roll of all kinds of grits of paper and a couple other things in it. Well, but anyways, quite often on a lot of this stuff, I put a coat of bush oil. This is a good example because I definitely did that on there. That dark ages it a little bit. I call it, you know, the 10-year aging process for cherry. And within 48 hours, 24. And again, any oil finish like that, you put it on, let it soak in, and you have to take every bit of it off. It's not a surface drying finish. And then I put acrylic lacquer over the top. I cut my lacquer 50-50, 50% lacquer, 50% thinner. So I have to use more coats, but they dry quicker and they give me the ability to penetrate very well. The bush oil, you can put any finish that you can think of. And I hate to use the swear word polyurethane, but you can even put poly over the top of it and it bonds. But so, you know, I do like 3 or 4 coats and then I rub it out with probably 600 grit paper. Put on maybe 2 more coats. See how it's doing, you know, getting my, because this is all sprays. And rub it out again. And then maybe, you know, the 6th or 7th coat. And again, you know, it sounds like this has taken an hour over a period of time, but it's only, if you want to look at it as work, it's only an hour. Then I take 1,000 grit paper that I have that has like a foam back to it. It's used for sanding out, usually metal flake paint jobs in the automotive industry. Rub that off, shoot my final coat, and quite often the final coat needs nothing. I can buff it down a little bit if I want to cut it from a semi-gloss or satin finish. But I like that. Now, after saying all of that, there's a rattle can lacquer called DEFT, D-E-F-T, which has to be the number one out of a can finish that there is. It's absolutely phenomenal. But once you've used approximately 2/3 of the can, throw it away. Yeah, well, once again, you've shot off most of the solvent in the mix for correct. And what you're getting on the bottom is sort of an incorrect mix. And if you want to find out if you ever want to get some, try it. Keep shooting down, and then when you get down, say below 2/3, shoot something, and then let it dry, and look at it. Then shake up a new can and shoot it, and tell me that there isn't 200% difference between the two things. So you got to sacrifice the cans. But Delph is a really nice finish. I oil my piece first. Rub it, you got to rub it off. You let it set, and you'll start to see when you look at it and it's on there. You mop it on. You'll see spots where it's flattened, it's soaking in quicker, end grain, of course. But you do enough of that and you wipe it right off, get it all down as if you were going to say, well, that's my finish, but it's not. And then wait 48 hours or so, and then you can put lacquer over it. No, not unless you feel, you got to use your fingers. Most cases, I do not find it raises the grain. But the thing, it does two things. One, it acts as a good penetrator, and your lacquers will bond well to it, but don't have to go as deep. So you're using actually less coats. And I think you get a much better final finish. The only thing you can't use it on is painted work and that, obviously, because any oil will just wipe the paint right out. We're talking about just natural, in between. But, so I mean, to me, I like the lacquer. I don't like gloss. Yep. All right. The finish, again, is just straight acrylic lacquer that I'm shooting over the top of it. Oh, yeah. Now, what would you mean?
But how do you get the metal?
Oh, how do you get it? All right.
The metallic finish that you have, the inside of that copper ball, and then
this
center of the
particular
medallion.
one was gilded with copper foil, like gold leaf. Then, and I can't remember right offhand, but the name, if you ever want to know anything about, this is called patinization. David Marks, the name is. It's potassium. I'm going to screw it up. It's a real mild chemical. No, it's potassium. Yeah, something like that. You take tissue paper. You wad tissue paper up. You put it in the bottom. The foil's on. Then I usually use a foam brush, those cheap foam brushes, in the chemical. And you just splatter it on the foil, on the tissue paper, and get it right off. Now, where the tissue paper has touched real heavy, it etches deeper. Where there were bubbles, you're left with the copper showing through on that. Now, that is what they call variegated leaf. It's heat-treated artificial gold. That looks just like that right out of the thing. So that wasn't touched by me outside of applying it. It's called variegated leaf. And it gives you that chemically kind of, blown out sort of look. And you can get red, blue, Mona Lisa, believe it or not, I think is the name of the outfit that you can get that from. No, it's leaf. You got to gild it. So it's all gilded, like gilding and the back. Now, one thing I learned a long time ago, which I think still going now. Okay. Does anybody recognize the name Giles Gilson? Yeah. All right, probably one of the most amazing individuals that's walked this planet. Giles did a lot of work with automotive paint on his vessels, which were, if you ever get a chance, type Giles Gilson and look at some of this stuff. It is just mind-blowing. Giles turned all his pots out of poplar and covered them in Bondo, but not, the glazing compound, because you can sand that down to get an absolutely flawless, non-grained finish. Bondo. Inside first, after it was turned. Yeah, the glazing compound. So when you sand it out, it's really, there's one or two small little voids I found afterwards, but it gives you a perfectly, for gilding or painting, when you're painting the entire surface in between there. Because the one thing that when you gild anything, you don't want any of the pores left. So when you sand it down to 600 or something, you want to seal it well. And quite often you actually want to paint it. They use, the hell's that sign painting stuff? Damn it. It's a very thick paint. You can use an airbrush, but I can't think of the name. Oh, God, I almost had it. Well, because you want that surface to be void of all grain. Because as soon as that gilding goes on, if there's grain in there, it shows right through. It bonds itself so well. So you want it as smooth as possible. These were done, they were painted. This is a piece of maple. That was painted red. God, I can't think of the name of it. Japan paint. Ah, there it is. Nasty stuff to work with because it's very thick. I find it hard to clean up. Very thick, so it was done in red first, sanded out, lacquered at least 3 or 4 times first, and then gilded over the top. And the same with this piece here. So that it was as smooth as possible, so I don't get any of the imperfections. In that case, grain would be an imperfection in the gilding. And then, you put the regular adhesives. And the only thing I had to do with this, and I kept thinking about it, because one of the problems with gilding, the stuff, if you breathe too hard, you'll suck it right. It's gone. It's, I don't know what it is, 1/1000th of a thousandth of a thousandth thick. So I was trying to figure out how I'm going to put that on a curved surface like that and not have it wrinkle. Because you can't always the wrinkles show as little lines. So what I ended up doing was I took a piece of hard construction paper cardboard or whatever it was, and I cut a square, and then I cut a square out of the inside of it that was bigger, just a little bit bigger than this. And I took the gilding and I slid it onto this open window, so to speak, taped the edges. So when I held it, I had, it looked like cellophane, hanging in a frame, so that I could take the frame and put it straight down over the top and it would just fold rather than wrinkle, and it worked. Because any kind of gilding, when you do it, unless you do water gilding, which is a whole different ballgame, you can't burnish it. The Rock of the Dome and all these places that have been gilded have been burnished afterwards, but that's a whole different world, because you got to use what they call a bowl, which is a finish to the interior, and it's a whole. So that way, when you got it on there, you can actually rub it and bring that gold, real gold, right out. But the big thing with gilding is it's very hard to air. Any kind of air movement, it flies around. But that's how those were done. Then you shot lacquer over the top.
Can you glaze? Can you add tint to the glaze?
Yeah, I did black. I just squeezed some black oil-based paint in it.
I suppose you could do anything.
I guess I tried. What did I do? I used it for something else. And I wanted it. Yeah. I think any solvent, but water won't work, I don't believe. Some of the things you try to tint, water-based dyes or anything, are a problem. Where oil-based or any of those seem to mix into a lot of stuff. Because that big bowl I was telling before was, I tinted the lacquer to get that color. Because if you use a stain or anything, you get absorption heavily in end grains and so on. But by tinting the lacquer very, very lightly, it was almost I decided on almost a non-existent rose color. It was so lightly tinted. And that color came as I shot each coat. I looked at it, and each coat, it got a hair darker. There's about 10 coats on that to get that color. But I was in total control of the color when I was done. Because I wanted it kind of as an accent, but not a statement, and yet not one of those that it went into the different kinds of grain. And that seemed to work really well. And that was just a solvent-based stain, but it happened to be given to me, the color red, that I added to that.
Can you mention the lacquer you used in that water gun?
The lacquer that I use is Sherwin-Williams acrylic lacquer.
And the air gun was?
Oh, that's an Iwata touch-up gun. Yeah, it's just a small, actually the guys that do, but I think it was designed originally when they were touching up because again, the reservoir, the container is only about that big. So you don't have to have a lot of paint in it. So if you went to have an automobile or anything done, you know, they're not going to take their big guns necessarily and fill it to shoot. So these touch-up guns kind of, I think, came from that, where they held a smaller amount. They're very high-tech, very good. Iwata and SATA, S-A-T-A, makes them. And you can get them. There's a neat airbrush site. It's called Dixie. It's in Louisiana. Dixie Airbrush. They carry everything you can think of in the airbrush world. And
Don't they make airbrushes too, Dixie?
no, I don't think so. Oh yeah, they got SATA, they got Iwata, and they've got all the parts. So if you ever have an airbrush and need a new needle or any of that kind of stuff, I mean, you can rebuild them. But Dixie is really nice, and that's where I got that knob. But I know they have those touch-up guns in their catalog online for air.
I got a question about your signature. I don't know if anybody looked at it, but do you have a trick for that?
The only thing I took, what the hell was it? What was it used for? There's a tip for wood burning that's like two pieces of wire that come together this way. It's not, they make what they call a signature tip, which has a little round ball on the end. I don't like it. No, I use Detail Master, but it doesn't come together to a point. It's like the wire comes out, turns around, and comes back. So it's almost rounded, but it's very small nickel cadmium. I can't even pronounce it. Yeah, that wire. And all I did was I very, very lightly filed it to a thinner surface. And when I go to sign it, my wood burning thing goes from 1 to 10, I think it is, you know, the heat register. Normally about 2.5. And you have to be slow because of and in different woods, it's harder. But for the most part, you know, you kind of get yourself nicely set, decide where you want it and how you want to do it, whether it's going to be 2 straight lines or follow the curve or whatever. And when you first put the tip on there and you start to make your move slowly, judge on how it's burning. Once in a while, 2.5, like on butternut, might be too much. So you got to back it off a little. On burls, sometimes it may not, like cherry, which seem to be very hard, maybe has to go up to maybe 3. But you very slowly just make your signature and you take your time. Once in a while, you may find that, like me, I got to pee. So I do this, around, and like that. Once in a while, I find that if I do this part, and as I start to come around the curve, it doesn't work as well as if I stop start and come backward to it. So I don't know how to explain that, but you got to judge on how it's coming out and not make your letters too small. Because what happens sometimes we make them too small. An E, for instance, becomes blob with a line because it doesn't leave anything between the line and this to make it an E. So you got to judge a little bit on what that is. But it's basically, when I do them, I'm holding them normally like this, or I've got them held real well, and I just very slowly get my hand bridged. So I'm not going in and out as much and take my time to do it. Which one do you want to do? But I'll tell you who I appreciated for his signature way back. In fact, it was at, I'll tell you exactly where it was. The Thetford Academy thing, when they do the, Jacques Vessery was there. And the only question I asked him was all over, I says, how do you do your signature? Because I noticed that his signatures were very, very good. And all he had me do was, he said, here's a piece of paper, write your name. So I went across, you go, okay, that's okay. And he says, just take your time and do it carefully. That was his answer to making them come out right. So I just kind of started playing around on pieces of wood to understand what he meant by that. And that's, where I came up with that. Well, because, to me, like I say, it's funny as you say it, but yeah, here's a guy that does all that feather work and neat stuff. And what's the question I ask him? How do you sign your work? Because I understood what you were saying, But I found that by taking it, and I don't know what tip he used, but I found that one tip by just taking a little bit, because it's just, like I say, it's just like the wire coming out and turn. So it's real tight, but there's no balls, no sharpness. And just filed it just a little so it isn't really cutting, but it's able to skip over the top just enough. Because I don't want it to cut in as much as I want it to glide. Yep. It's just like I say, it comes out and touches itself and immediately turns. So you got just a little, that kind of effect on the end.
Where'd you get your t-shirt?
Woodstock, New York.
When? Back in
No.
the day?
I used to do a show there all the time, and New Pulse. And there was an outfit down there that made them, they used Champion t-shirts. They made all this stuff. I don't know whatever happened. They're not around anymore. So that's where it came from. All right.